Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're delighted to have Tania Anaissie on our podcast. Tania is the founder and CEO of Beytna Design, a founding creator of Liberatory Design, a founding member of the Equity Design Collaborative, former faculty at the National Equity Project, and a former lecturer at the Stanford d.school. She has built a way of practicing design that helps organizations translate equity values into equitable products, programs, and cultures. She's an expert content creator and facilitator with over a decade of experience working globally. Tania is a graduate of Stanford University's product design program, an advisor in Stanford's Design Impact program, and a StartingBloc fellow. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Tania Anaissie. She's the founder and CEO of Beytna Design. Tania, welcome.
Thank you. It's fun to be here.
We're so happy to have you here. We've been looking forward to this for a while. So please tell us about yourself.
Oh, yes. What to say? Well, I am calling in today from San Francisco. I'm based in the Bay Area in California. And I am a designer by training. I graduated from the product design program at Stanford and have since been obsessed with how to use design to be a force for liberation, to support justice and liberation movements. That's a bit about me. I also grew up between Arkansas in the US and Lebanon, where my family is from. Spent a lot of summers in the mountains of Lebanon and in Beirut. And I have two cats that if you're watching on video, you will see.
I love that. I always, like, in your videos or in our calls, I see one wandering around in a very nonchalant way. Like, I aspire to be that. So that's very motivating for me at the moment. Well, you said some very big words in there and also other things that we would aspire to. So tell us why, especially the word like liberation, and that kind of came into play for you and how that evolved into also Beytna's work.
I think growing up in Arkansas, especially as a Arab American family after 9/11, there was a lot of confusion and hurt around how people were treating us and how people perceived us. Um, you know, very outright things like bullying at school, or my mom's a physician and patients would say like, "Oh, I don't want to see her. I don't want to see the foreign doctor." And so there was a lot of like very overt experiences growing up that felt like both, people's behavior, but also systems, like the way that schools would process discipline and how they would perceive my brother as quote unquote like dangerous for doing normal child things. And there were a lot of issues that at the time it sort of felt like, why is this happening? Is this our fault? Like, what's going on? And I had a lot of confusion and hurt about it. And as I got older, I really started to understand how these systems work, how narrative is formed, especially about Arab Americans in this case after 9/11 in the media, and how that fits in with our culture and our history of race. So I think that was the beginning, was sort of like, I love my family, I love my community. Why is this happening to us? And learning about other liberation movements and other communities who have built wonderful, joy-filled resistance movements. And I felt like, yes, I want that. And I want to understand that. And simultaneously, I was at school studying design. So that's when I was having both of these little epiphanies. Like, ooh, design is so powerful, but there's some things that aren't sitting right with me. And then simultaneously, like if I want to do work that contributes to the movements to change things for people like me and my family, and those we're in solidarity with, like how was the big question for years, how to do both.
I love that so much, and I feel like this is something I experienced in a similar but different way. Where I grew up in U.S. and then I was born in U.S., grew up in Turkey. I'm Turkish American, and then I moved back to U.S. after college, and I spent a year in St. Louis, and I outright experienced where my other Turkish friends who like we would hang out together in Turks, and I would be perceived as the American because maybe I have more acceptable looks for Americans, and then my other Turkish friends were like, "Oh, you're Turkish friends." I'm like, "Wait, I'm Turkish too, right?" So I straight up like experienced that just by like looks, like the different interactions I would experience even though I identified as same, and how much that just like impacted, right? Just because you look a little different, you're not part of us. And it was like so, and experiencing that in my like 20s was so weird, and it was so uncalled for, and I didn't expect that. And then that was just like a, wow, like how much. And then then I we had conversations with like my other Turkish American friends who were born and raised in US, and
Mm.
they shared their own experiences growing up, and if they had more like darker skin, dark hair, they the way they grew up was like completely different than mine. So yeah, so I definitely understand and relate, but like also like my experience was the complete contrast, just because I don't know, like I somehow fit in like American standards or like whatever. But
Oh,
I love that
so hard.
you're in like design space too, because then you're kind of the like design opens up the way, and it's always constructive, right? So it starts talking about solutions, and some suddenly this is not like a problem anymore, this is a challenge that you can address. um so I would love to hear how, I guess, like, so you had your personal experience, and then you're learning of the power of design, and they started to like come together. So how did this, like, I guess, start shaping up in design action?
Ooh. So when I was having these big epiphanies, it was after I graduated from the program, I was working at the D.school, which is like a design thinking hub at Stanford. I was teaching classes there, managing some programs. I worked there for 3 years. I think that's where all the epiphanies were happening, is while I was
Mm.
actually teaching and doing consulting work. On the side. And that's where I had some doubts when I was a student, like, that doesn't sit right. You would hear things like people don't know what they want, you have to tell them what they want, or you know, just failure is a natural part of design, which I do think is true. But often we would fail and hurt people, and it's just kind of like, oh, we're just trying things out, and it did. So there's a lot of things that didn't feel right.
Yeah.
But when I started teaching and doing my own projects in the real world and connecting with people who've been in the industry longer than me, it started to feel like, oh no, wait, there's some real tensions here. Um, and so that question became, at the time, it felt like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Like, what do I even believe in design anymore? It felt like more of a crisis at the time. But in retrospect, I call it R&D. It was research and development.
I love that. You were incubating. Yeah.
Yes, didn't feel that way, but yeah, so I was connecting with anyone else in the US. There was a group of us that found each other. It eventually became the Equity Design Collaborative. But we
Mm.
just pieced together, like, someone had an article, someone posted something here. And so we started pulling each other, like connecting with each other online. There are people in Florida, St. Louis, DC, obviously Bay Area. And so one of them organized to have us do monthly calls and just talk about, like, what are you thinking about? What are you building? And folks were across the spectrum. Some folks had already been working on it for a couple of years. Some people were new. And so that became the first affirming, like, yes, no, this is a thing. Other people believe in it. There are other ways to practice. Um, I'm totally losing track of your question, but I think that's the point when
That was your action. Yeah, yeah.
okay, yes, yes,
But no,
great.
it's great because I mean, it's still, we're talking about the similar problem, but just like different contexts, right? So you experienced kind of like how differences kind of could lead to like exclusion in a more like social level growing up, right? But then when you got into design, the field itself, exactly to your point, is the best field for you to be in, especially to like address challenges. But at the same time, there are inherent problems in the field itself, right? So while you think like, yay, now I have all the tools and I can save the world, like suddenly you're like, oh wait, I'm not being hired right now. Like, what's happening? Right? Like my partner is a Turkish British, and he's an architect, and he talks about, like, you could show up to a room with a Scandinavian accent and say you're a designer, you're like accepted, right? Like but
Mm,
like there's no like worldwide known or thought about like Turkish architects or whatever that
mm,
they, so we have these like perceptions or ideals or even idols that we create in the design field that kind of dilutes the purpose of what we try to do in design in general,
mm.
right? And to your point too, exactly, like design technically encourages failure, and then you're like, if you fail, like, I mean, I don't know if any of the listeners here like went into like an architectural critic, right, in like school. It's like slammed like models and people like
Oof.
crying and harsh words being said. Like, so you get, well, wait, where are we supposed to fail?
Oh, that hurts the heart. I've only witnessed one critique of such magnitude. And
Oh, really?
I remember thinking like, this is not how humans should treat each other. This is not helpful in any way. No one is learning. People are just crying.
Exactly. Like, um, there was this post like recently I read. If you believe like you have to be an asshole, to be like an asshole to be like a successful leader or to like inspire people, you might just be an asshole. Because like
Ooh,
there's huge,
zing.
there's a huge difference between being demanding and demeaning, and I think that was like, yes, and I think it's a field very filled with ego as well, right?
Mm,
That
mm,
translates into so many different ways. And
mm,
I don't know if this like aggression or ego is like also a way of like us trying to cover up our insecurities or all the nerve wracking things about the design field too, because design is like being in the gray. You're like comfortable with like ambiguous stuff. You may not be right, right? Like you have to have self security and go out there and ideate and throw out ideas into the world. And they might be very stupid ideas, but you have to have that bravery to do that. So um, maybe like I would love to get your quick thoughts on this, how this field kind of morphed the space, how like this feels kind of like suddenly converted into a space of like showcasing and stardom. While the
mm,
main purpose of the field has always been like, let's come up with designs and solutions for the world and for the people or for the planet, right? So I don't know, any speculations you have on that, like when and how that happened, that called for liberation, I would love to hear. But I don't know if you also like still to this day experience this a little bit, even though it feels like overall it's things are changing.
mm. Yeah, I'm thinking. What a good question. It's a good question about how it happened. I'm not sure. I do remember feeling like that's something that felt a bit icky when I was learning design and practicing design. In particular, we can't really execute any of these projects or come up with any of these ideas without working with people who have lived experience, right? Who know the problem, unfortunately, usually because they've had to.
Exactly.
And, but I would go to design conferences and people would present about these amazing projects and what a cool job they did, but then they wouldn't ever talk about the people they interviewed or that they worked with on the ground. And it was sort of this like, I'm the designer, I'm fancy. I mean, even to apply to jobs, you've seen the requirement for the portfolio. It's always like, what did you do on this project? How did you make this great? And it's almost like inviting this erasure of like, yeah, I did this by myself. Design is inherently collaborative, but like, don't worry about that. Just
But I'm the
not that people
genius.
are. Yes, I'm a genius, which honestly is like what they're asking you to prove in the job interview. They're like, well, show us how you made this great. And so I feel like that's such a hard part of the, like, yes, how do you show how you can contribute on a team, but without the stardom, it is definitely, I mean, even within our field, within the equity design world, I think that naturally happens. Like people want to follow someone that they believe in, that they hear interesting things from.
Mhm.
But that's something I love about just, I don't know, the nature of how large the world is and how much ideas move. Like I think when we were first working on the equity design collaborative, it felt sort of lonely within our pod and it felt sort of niche. Like I would go to design conferences and present, and people would kind of be like, over the history of design. I remember learning in my design program, which I loved. We did this class that talked about the different eras of design, how each, like many eras across the world had their own manifestos of like,
Yeah.
this is what design is. And then 10 years later, no, this is what design is. And so I felt like, oh, this is part of our field. This is just like, you know, when the world changes, when cultures change, we reinvent design. But that, I don't think that's how it was received. We got a lot of pushback on like this is cool if it's a project, you know, working with poor people or with like
Oh,
racism.
oh,
But this is like, you know, versus like how do we move the field forward? But now I feel like the tenor's really changed. Speaking to like moving away from the idols, there is obviously there's liberatory design, which I co-created. There's equity centered community design, design justice, restorative design, environment first design, right? Like you're nodding your head. We could write a list of like 50, 60 different
yeah.
kinds across the world. And that to me is very exciting because it means that we have more micro leaders, right? In different regions, different parts of the world that are presenting ideas and other people are taking it. Like I met someone at a conference recently who was like, "Hi, I'm a liberatory designer." I was like, "Oh my God, I don't know you. I've never met
I
you,
love
but
you.
like you're you." This is awesome. And then every time someone emails us that they're using the card deck, we're like, how? How did you change it? What did you do to make it better? So I do feel there is like a larger, I'm curious if you would agree in what you're seeing in your pocket of the design world, but I feel like there is more of an opening of like, we can own this, we can democratize this. It's hopefully less about like the hero or the firm. You know, there's always like
Yeah.
the design firm, and more like, oh, now here's the whole database.
Yeah. I mean, I'm definitely seeing that shift where we're moving from a world of like the Louis Vuittons and Chanel's to just like more like looking into meaning, really. Like, what are they doing really? Like, more zooming into the work than the name, the flashy names.
Mm,
And I see that across like various different fields. And there's a notion of like not design for, but with more
mm,
and more. I think those are happening. So, and in that sense, I also feel like there is less education and definitely more acceptance and like open ideation around like what we're talking about, right? To your point, exactly, when you went to like conferences a few years ago and you're not even like long ago, right? Like several years ago, and you're talking about like liberatory design, people are maybe just like, and then like now they're like, oh, right. So I think that is great. How that translates into work in industries, I feel like we're just at the beginning now, right? Like there's so much to do because there's so many inherent existing archaic systems in place that needs to change. So
mm.
whatever we're working on feels like mini interventions at this point, and there's a lot to be done. I don't know if you feel the same. And I would love to hear
Yes.
your experience on like how the conversation has evolved for you, where you were like straight on education and raising awareness potentially on like liberatory design to now working onto active projects to see how those projects translate really into action.
Yes. I think so around that R&D time where I was co-creating Liberatory Design and me and five others, it was David, Susie, Tom, and Victor. We created this card deck, and that was our first like, this is what we think. There's, ways of being and doing design, but there's also mindsets that guide how you like, what do we believe is good design? How do we show up as designers? And then after we created that original framework, we all went back to our organization and sort of developed it on our own. So I'll speak to the like Beytna Design version of Liberatory Design that we've built. And working with partners, that started at the same time too as when Beytna started, was immediately I was like, okay, this is great in theory. Like, what can I do with partners? And then also like, what do they need and what is helpful to them? So then that was like a second maturity level of R&D, which is like, how do we, to your point, actually do this? And how is it helpful and how is it not helpful? Um, and I think there's like a couple levels of impact. One, sometimes working at scale, like if it's a tech company, we're working with some, or, a bank, the scale is so high that it's like, if we can change just how user researchers connect with the community when they're designing products, or if we can just change how much they involve people in the choices and the designs and the implications. We have this concept at Design, we built a tool called at Beytna Design called Safe to Fail, which is like, how do we fail in a way that's not going to hurt people emotionally, physically, financially? Like, how do we, if you can change small things at scale, that feels like, wow, that could have a very large impact, whether that's on number of people or amount of harm reduced. Um, and then there's also where we go deep. So some of the partners we work with, a lot of nonprofits or maybe foundations are saying we want to change our org culture. So how do we solve problems? How do we partner with people that have lived experience? We want to fundamentally change how we work, basically, right? Because the status quo is not working for us. And then how we use liberatory design is like, we're going to work with them for 6 months, sometimes 2 years, to build their design capacity for all the projects and challenges they face to use this equitable design process. So it's interesting because there's both on one side designers being like, we want to change our practice. We're not getting the outcomes we want. It doesn't feel right. And so we jump in and help them with like the nitty gritty of the process. And then on the flip side, the people who are like, I'm kind of new to design, but I care about doing liberation work. Liberatory design is a way to do that. Awesome. Teach me how to do design. So it's like working with people who are deep in the design world and who are very new. And those are kind of our two levels of impact to both. And honestly, at this point, I'll probably be this way until I retire. I feel like every project is an experiment, right? It's like, oh, that worked really well when they went deep. They changed 5 programs and policies versus like, oh, actually we changed one thing over here at scale and now, 2 million users are impacted. So I don't necessarily have yet a rubric of like, this is what I want to see happen. I'm just like, if people are interested, people are going to work hard. I think wherever I can help. My vision is like, if I can add a drop in the river of social justice movements in my lifetime, that will have been a great success. So I'm trying to figure out where's the place to drop.
I know. Oh my God. So many of the things you're saying here is like resonating in like so many different ways. I think like as a person, I have I have tendency to have a systemic view, like systems view, which could be very paralyzing at times. And I always
Mm.
like, that's like a motto I say to myself, like 1/0, right? Like 1/0. You do one thing that's greater than zero, and that's like progress. And you need to acknowledge progress. And I think, yeah, I feel like in these fields, especially as we're also like paving the way of what designing with and design by looks like, right? Um, I feel like the more I get into it, the more I feel like a student. Like, and that's why I like call myself a forever student. Like, I don't think, yes, you can be like an expert on like the process maybe, and you might have like a Rolodex of case studies, but I feel exactly like you, where I'm like, I don't know if we can ever say like this is right or wrong, especially how you see things can change when they're like culture specific or community specific or human specific, right? um and I think what you touched upon in terms of like working with like corporations too, I think we have to kind of also like move away from like the general public tendency is to be like, oh, these cool new companies or design studios or like young brands are doing these like cool stuff, and like, yeah, the corporate is evil and they're like old school and whatever. But corporations have the potential, they bring in the potential for us to scale what we're trying to do, right, and make it a much broader conversation. And that's huge power, right? Because in the
Mm.
end, we could be doing all the coolest stuff and try to advocate for things, and we would be in our tiny like 10-20 people like groups and teams, and it won't reach that far. And I think corporations have the power to really take the conversation far, and
Mm.
highlighting that collaboration and the need for working with like not only different nonprofits and CBOs and organizations, but also corporations and all these parties who may not really be familiar with these terms or have an idea how they might incorporate into their like day-to-day processes. It's still very, very crucial. And I feel like, I don't know if you feel the same way, like the navigation of that is the unspoken project. Like if there's a project on like liberatory design, the corporate navigation and how to implement it is like the bigger project that nobody talks about. I don't know if you feel that way.
Oh, yes.
Like this is
Yes.
something I wish like somebody would tell me like when I'm in school, like these are the, I feel like anyone like going into these like fields, I think there's so many nuances and ways of working we can learn on that I think goes even more further than my personal knowledge on theories of generative design.
Totally. I hear that. I have a mentor, Mario Lugai, who started this platform called Giving Side. And Mario will say, like, we're always here to work with the angelic troublemakers, which is like, yes, there's this big company, but I say we choose people to partner with, less so the company. Like, of course, that does matter. We heavily consider that. But if there's a group of people who are trying to push as far as they can and aligned to our values and have a lot of internal influence, then like, hell yeah, we're going to get in there and try. Like, I really hope it works. It's possible it doesn't, and we've seen that at some of the biggest companies in the world, people, who care a lot about justice, about supporting their users, radically changing how they could benefit, especially in tech, like really rethinking, could we be of immense value to the world? Could we support human growth and healing? Um, if those people are willing to push hard and get things done, like, we're so there. That's my belief system. It's like, I'm glad to help. And if it doesn't work, like, we'll learn as much as we can. The caveat there, this connects to something you said earlier, is also like, it, but with a mindfulness of not creating harm. It's not like we're going to go in there and be like, oh, well, didn't work. It's like, we're very vigilant along the way of how do we experiment in a way that's safe, push as much as we can, but not leaving it worse than it was. So yeah, I'll pause there. I could say a lot more about that, but I'm pro working with
Yeah.
companies. If you find people that you think are willing to push and work hard, then it's like, cool, we can move at scale, like you're saying.
Definitely. And you're so right. Like in the end, it's not like when you say, it's almost like instead of like naming the certain politicians who are messing up a country, we just say a country's name. It's kind of like that, the corporation. But then like when you zoom in, there's so many lovely people working in these like companies that are well intentioned, want to do the right thing. They just maybe don't have the internal mechanisms, or the system that they are in is not allowing them to do so. So I think we see there's more openness for collaboration with smaller studios and companies by corporations, which I think is necessary.
Mm.
And thankfully that is happening more, right? Because I think traditionally, like big company collaborates with big agency, that's not necessarily translating in outcomes that are that authentic, right? But as we're seeing this shift happening, you see people are open, and they're open to learn too. And yeah, like, and to your point, the safe to fail experimentation, right? Like whatever you're doing is not working already, right?
Yes, correct.
let's try this way. But I love that you mentioned harm, and I also want to like unpack what like harm means, because I think it's not only about like, I feel like in a corporate lens, harm is like, oh, like we lost money on this and it didn't result in a
Mm,
big PR blowout, right? But harm could also mean like, I mean, especially when you work with underserved or overlooked communities, so many of these communities, people go them, ask questions, and leave, and it just
yes.
does not result in anything. So there is this lot of historic baggage and trauma and distrust towards larger institutions. So by simply, again, doing a research and going asking a bunch of questions, not compensating people's times, and then
Mhm.
not resulting in something is also harm, right? So I think we need to kind of like, maybe this should be like an open conversation too, because the world that we live in calls for more and more safe to fail experimentation, right? Because we're in a much more complex world today, and the only way we can solve problems is by probing and seeing if things are working. So we have to also acknowledge though, like, okay, let's define what safe to fail is, and define what harm could be, especially considering the communities that we're working with.
100%. I love it. And like we'll never able, as much as we plan, it's probably impossible to say we have predicted every potential way this could go wrong ever. And we have mitigated all of them. Like that's also not what we're saying. But I think right now there's such a rush to release, to push, to profit that it's just sort of like totally overlooked. Or even in the digital world, it's like, let's just push this feature and see how it works. And then it really messes things up. And they're like, I guess that didn't work. But then what happens to all the people that got hurt? So yeah, I think there's
Oh,
something in
we
between.
launched an entire product. I completely missed that part. Like, yeah, I think those are like two, like in real estate, you see it's like so lagging, it's not even funny. And then in like tech, you see everything is like out there tomorrow, where you miss on so many things. So we kind of like need to slow down intentionally, but also not to the point that we are like curbing innovation and progress, right? So
Totally.
that balance, and I feel, I'm sure you feel the same way, but the more you have a diverse collaborative party, that naturally that balance happens, right? Because everybody has their own pace.
Totally. Yeah.
So that's
Right.
a good way to like mitigate it.
100%. It helps so much. Plus, it's like people are catching things, people can speak to different experiences. It's so helpful. And it's really, yeah, I feel like also the solutions and ideas are just better. Like it's like, oh, well, if we're going to slow down, if we co-design, or if we need to understand the context before we launch something that's going to take more time to get to a project launch. Like, yeah, but so is launching something really shitty that ends up hurting people. By the way, the media finds out. It's like, we could also do that, but it's not working for you. So are you willing to slow down a little bit to like, make a better idea,
That's
basically?
my favorite part. Oh, so you don't want to test any of your assumptions? So
Yes.
you're like really willing to like go in blind and see, let's just see what happens after we invest $500,000.
That's very hard. Yeah. And it's awesome. Honestly, I'm curious if you feel this way. It's part of the reason I love being a consultant is we hold an immense amount of power
Mm,
in terms of internal influence within those systems. So sometimes I'll work with partners at huge corporations and they're like, we want to do this, this, this. I'm like, yeah, totally. This is why I totally agreed. Let's do it this way. And then all of a sudden I've said it. and their leadership is like, oh, the consultant. And my team, by the way, has been saying it for like 5 years. But once I came in, it was like, yes, this is what I believe. I think that's also an awesome ability, because they hire us because they want our perspective. They want to do something different. And
Yeah.
that's one of my favorite parts, is just like, how do we move things quicker, because we have expertise, and it comes with that level of power, for better or for worse, that people will listen to us because we're from the outside. I don't think it should be that way. I think they should be able to recognize the great ideas inside the company.
Yeah.
But if we can help, that's awesome.
Do you feel like, and I know you and I have talked about this before too, like your studio setup, right? Your size, the fact that you're agile or whatever. Do you feel like it impacts how you could say or like share thoughts with like clients or partners? Like, do you feel like that's more empowering than, I don't know, my always like eternal assumption is that the larger you are, the harder it gets to like speak your mind, because now you're responsible of like 500 people and you don't necessarily know all those 500 people, so you can't really speak on behalf of your team, right? So do you feel like this like lean agile design studio also like brings you power to be that powerful consultant?
Oh, yes. I wish we could talk about this for 3 more hours. Yes. Because now you're talking about like the business side and how it impacts your culture and all that. Yes. I don't know what the future holds for Beytna, in the long term, but in the short term, I definitely believe in having a small agile team. To your point, like, we're constantly learning. We can see what each other are learning. We can adapt. And it's, yeah, I think that's the hard part with growing the business.
Yeah.
Is I started this business to like create sustainability and stability for me and my family. And I don't want to be in a situation where I'm kind of trapped, which is, you didn't say that, but that's how I would feel, where you're just like, oh, I don't really like this project, or it doesn't super align, or I need to push them more, but our payroll is $500,000 a month and I can't risk that.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
that's what scares me. Doesn't mean you can't grow and do good work. It just feels like I want to go at a pace where I feel like I can control it. When we get too big,
Going
it's
back
hard.
to the pace, right? Like growing companies, I'm sure, have much more cultural issues than firms that really like matured over time, right? So I think there's definitely that. And I think maybe like one way to hack that, and we often talk about this with my friend Christine, who's founder of Open Inclusion. She also like found a firm to grow to 60 people very fast. I think she sold out, and now her team is like 15 people. I was like, I'm not growing.
Okay,
So
cool.
like, you're like, can we just like find all these like studios that we really admire the work, and then we all like come together, like if we really need to do a super large project, like we all do it together so we don't have to grow. Like that's my like ultimate like collective business model, like mutualistic business model,
Nice.
in order to hedge that risk. I don't even know if it's a risk, but like, yeah, I know we talked about this before, and I think it's important to highlight this too, because the nuances not only is like the corporate navigation too, but even your business and how it's structured kind of impacts how much you can serve your mission and the way the values you also like hold while serving that mission too. So I think especially in the world where we're like exploring like equity, I feel like even more responsible and accountable to be like, I want to be able to speak up, right?
Yes.
In a very
Totally.
polite, diplomatic, approachable way, but I want to be able to like just say no, or like that doesn't sound right, because I'm not responsible to like 1,000 people, or I don't have a board that I also need to like go back and report to.
Totally.
But yeah, I think that's important to highlight. But we're not saying this as an advice, like never grow.
No, totally. Just my personal opinion, my personal choice.
But speaking advice, we would love to get nuggets of information from you for anyone who wants to try to make progress in this world, regardless of the field. What would be your advice to them?
Oh, so like designers specifically, or just anyone who wants to change the world? Okay, great, cool. Oh boy. Oh man. Now I'm like, whoa, everyone. What would I say? Okay, let me think. I think, okay, something that I learned from my mentors early on was how important it was. I think there's again, Mario, one of my mentors taught me so much, comes from community organizing, described to me the life cycle of an activist, which I would describe as just like someone who cares deeply about changing the world. And there's this phase where like you think it's your fault. Like I was speaking to my childhood, like you feel a lot of personal pressure and shame. And then you discover how messed up things are in the systems. And then you get super mad. You're like, what the F? Like, this is how we're treating people. This is how healthcare works. What? And you get super mad and you're like, this is not okay. And sometimes if you can find people that are mentors to you, that find joy in the work, that are doing this out of passion, like you, it changes fundamentally how you are in the work. Because then it becomes about like, I'm showing up to work on things I love with people I love. This is going to be fun. It's also going to be hard, but it's going to be fun. But sometimes folks get stuck in the pain and they never find that community. The way Mario describes it is like we used to come together in these political homes, whether that was a bowling group, a religious group, like whatever it was, people had a place to come together when things were hard and to talk about what they were upset about. But that's become increasingly dissolved, especially during the pandemic. And so people are seeing a lot of this and learning a lot of this and getting super angry online. And then they're like, who can I talk to? Who's going to mentor me? Like, how do I see the joy in the action part? And the only thing that groups are asking them to do online is like, donate. You're mad, donate. You're mad, donate. And so there's this loss of this, like that critical part of the cycle. So I would say that would be my invitation is if people want to be sustainable in this work is find your crew, whether they're peers or mentors. You need people to just be able to decompress with and to get excited about the work and to feel like you can move from the pain into the joy, because the pain fuels us or it can completely stop us. And so I've seen a lot of people, especially, you know, my cousins and friends and family in the younger generation getting in the stop phase. I'm like, no, we need you. This movement needs you. And also I want you to be happy. So I'm trying to find, that's my invitation is like, find what you need to get to the joy-filled anger and lessen the pause.
What a beautiful advice. I love that so much. Find your crew. And also like to turn that anger into productivity, right? Not like just like yelling out into the world or even to your like donations. Yeah, but like, do you really feel like you're acting on it? So I think channeling that somehow, and I do like, it's a very hard thing too, right? There's so many problems in the world that at some of the state, as for some of them, maybe I'm in a more productive stage, but for some of them, when I hear about it, I'm still angry. So maybe
yes, totally.
Process. But it's such a beautiful advice, and oh my God, I love that so much. That's great. Thank you. And this was such a treat. I think we can just like talk for hours on like everything.
Agreed.
So for everyone listening, this is like a snapshot of if we were like to come together and what this might have looked like. Just a lot of like excited back and forth feedback. But Tania, it's such a pleasure. I think you're such a delightful presence in the field of design too. And I truly encourage everyone to check out your work in studio and try to be part of the crew.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. This is such a treat. It really was.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.